spring 1945, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy is 28, and the Second World War is reaching its bloody conclusion. After leaving the Navy and recuperating from his ordeal in the South Pacific, Kennedy obtains a position as a special correspondent for Hearst newspapers. The assignment kept Kennedy's name in the public eye as he covered several major events in world history, including the conference in San Francisco that led to the founding of the United Nations, after which Kennedy presciently wrote, "With its elaborate mechanics, the organisation would prove ineffectual in resolving the great issues of war and peace, especially given that the larger countries would refuse to entrust it with sufficient decision-making power." He also attended the Potsdam Conference in Germany, which was intended to enable the three major powers, the US, Russia, and the UK, to plan the post-war peace, during which he noted that the Russians are never going to pull out of their zone of occupation, but plan to make their part of Germany a Soviet Socialist Republic, an event which duly happened. Thanks to his family's connections, Kennedy got to meet some of the top players, including President Truman and future President Eisenhower, with whom he was very much impressed by. These experiences showing he was on his way to belonging on the international stage. No one knew at the time that present at Potsdam was not only the 33rd president, but also the 34th and the 35th. These experiences in San Francisco and Germany confirmed to Kennedy that he wanted to be a participant rather than a mere observer. Thanks to some machinations from Joe Kennedy, a congressional vacancy arose for the 11th District in Boston. It was to be filled in 1946. This was a heavily working class, Catholic and Democratic-leaning district in which the Kennedys had long and deep roots. By the end of 1945, Kennedy's mind was made up to seek the seat. He just had to win the nomination against a large field on the Democratic side. Kennedy moved to Beacon Hill within the district and before long proved himself an effective campaigner. He would introduce himself to voters as a combat veteran returning to lead the country for which he had fought. "The new generation offers a leader," read the campaign slogan. While he didn't have to earn a living, he utilised every minute of the day getting out and meeting people. He was tireless in driving himself forward, with one group of voters particularly enamoured of his approach: women. He was to prevail in the primary vote, coming first in a 10-candidate field with 41% of the vote. The actual contest in November would be a much easier affair. He would win over 70% of the votes cast, despite a nationwide shift to the Republicans. This shift allowed in California an ambitious Navy veteran, one Richard Nixon, to ride that wave to victory. Kennedy, at now 29, was an elected US congressman being sworn in on January the 3rd, 1947. He would serve for 6 years, but was far more interested in international affairs than the office of congressman would enable him to influence. His impact as a congressman was decidedly limited, and he began positioning himself for statewide office. As early as 1949, Kennedy once again, with the help of Joe Sr.'s money, began preparing to run for the Senate in 1952 against the long-time Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. It would prove to be a hard-fought victory requiring all his energy, drive, hard work, charm, Joe's finances, and considerable assistance from the rest of the Kennedy clan, including younger brother Robert, who was campaign manager. The margin of victory over Lodge proved to be just a single percentage point, perhaps helped by Lodge's less hard-working approach to the campaign, turning his attention to it only with 2 months to go to Election Day. Sensing danger, he increased his efforts in the final weeks of the campaign, but wherever he visited, John Kennedy had visited before him. Estimates claim that Kennedy shook 5 hands for every single hand Lodge did, in a grim night for Democrats, with the Republicans winning back the presidency after 20 years. They also had a clean sweep of Congress. The one bright spot in all of this was Jack Kennedy. This swimming against the Republican tide could not have been done without an exceptional candidate and an exceptional campaign, which exemplified a new kind of personalised politics, carefully crafted to enhance the candidate's image, relying on massive and varied uses of media, including television. It was around this time that he met the woman he would marry, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier. He had first met her in the spring of 1951, and they would be married before the end of 1953. Kennedy would spend 7 years as a senator, though most observers consider these years as an interlude. He had several spinal operations in the years after the election and was even given the last rites. His Senate career would produce no major legislation, and Lyndon Johnson had a particularly dim view of his performance, considering Kennedy a mere playboy. He did, however, achieve a thumping re-election to the Senate in 1958 with nearly 3/4 of the vote. However, by then his focus had really turned to running for the presidency. During his time in the Senate, the vice presidency had been filled by one Richard Nixon, and it would soon be his turn to stand for the presidency on the Republican side. On January the 2nd, 1960, Kennedy announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. Though some questioned Kennedy's age and experience, his charisma and eloquence earned him numerous supporters. He faced several potential challengers for the Democratic nomination, including Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, Adlai Stevenson II, who had been the candidate several times already, and Senator Hubert Humphrey. As before, Kennedy's presidential campaign was a family affair, funded by his father and with his younger brother Robert acting as his campaign manager. Kennedy travelled extensively to build his support amongst the Democratic elites and voters. At the time, party officials controlled most of the delegates, but several states also held primaries, and Kennedy sought to win several of these primaries to boost his chances of winning the nomination. He won the Wisconsin primary, effectively ending Humphrey's hopes of winning the nomination. He then went on to do so again in a competitive West Virginia primary in which there was not a large Catholic bloc, unlike Wisconsin. This made Kennedy a serious contender for the nomination. When Kennedy entered the convention, he had the most delegates, but not enough to ensure that he would win the nomination. Stevenson, the 1952 and 1956 presidential nominee, remained very popular in the party, while Lyndon Johnson also hoped to win the nomination with the support from party leaders. Gaining twice as many delegates as Johnson on the first ballot, they did not clinch victory until the end of the roll call, when Wyoming's 15 votes gave the Kennedy campaign 763 delegates. This was two more than the required majority. Despite there being 7 presidential deaths that had led to the elevation of vice presidents, presidential nominees thought almost exclusively about how their choice of vice president would affect the coming election, leading Woodrow Wilson to have commented on the office of the vice president, quote, "In saying how little there is to be said about it, one has evidently said all there is to say." Kennedy, however, wanted someone who could help in a close election and have indisputable competence as a possible successor. Putting aside the personal attacks on him that Johnson had made during the nomination battle, Kennedy knew Lyndon B. Johnson was well qualified to be president if it ever came to it. While politically, Johnson seemed the most likely of all to help win crucial states. The traditionally solid Democratic South promised this time to be a sharply contested battleground. Reluctance among Southern Protestants to vote for a Catholic worried Jack and encouraged him to seek an advantage in Texas and across the South by taking the Texas-based Johnson. Kennedy announced Johnson as his choice of running mate on the afternoon following his nomination. Initial polls following the Democratic convention gave Jack a 17 to 22% lead in the 5 biggest states: California, Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, and crucially, Texas. Meanwhile, Kennedy's Republican opponent, Richard Nixon, had no serious opposition to the Republican nomination. During their 4 years together in the House, Kennedy and Nixon had enjoyed a civil relationship. During the 50s, however, Nixon's campaign tactics and harsh attacks on the Democrats had diminished Kennedy's regard for him. The Kennedys expected Nixon to fight hard and dirty. At the start of the campaign, Nixon held a 6-point lead in the polls. A widely regarded turning point was the fact that the two campaigns agreed to a series of televised debates. An estimated 70 million Americans watched the first debate from Chicago's CBS studio. Kennedy had met the day before with the producer to discuss the design of the set and the placement of the cameras. Nixon, just out of the hospital after a painful knee injury, did not take advantage of this opportunity, and during the debate looked at the reporters asking the questions and not at the camera. Kennedy wore a blue suit and shirt to cut down on glare and appeared sharply focused against the grey studio background. Nixon wore a light-coloured suit that blended into the grey background. In combination with the harsh studio lighting that left Nixon perspiring, he offered a less than commanding presence. By contrast, Kennedy appeared relaxed, tanned and telegenic while looking into the camera whilst answering the questions. Pollsters have stated that the debates raised interest, boosted turnout, and gave Kennedy an extra 2 million votes, mostly as a result of the first debate. The debates are now considered a milestone in American political history, the point at which the medium of television began to play a dominant role in politics. Although he and Nixon spent a great part of the contest arguing over specific issues, Kennedy gained an early advantage by addressing his opening statement directly to the American people. He also did the same in his closing statement. By contrast, Nixon used his introduction and summary to draw contrasts between himself and Kennedy. The difference was telling. Kennedy came across as a leader who intended to deal with the nation's greatest problems. Nixon registered on voters as someone trying to gain an advantage over an adversary. The Kennedy campaign gained momentum after this first debate, and he pulled slightly ahead of Nixon in most polls. On election day, Kennedy defeated Nixon in one of the closest presidential elections of the 20th century. In the national popular vote, by most accounts, Kennedy led Nixon by just over 100,000 votes. This was out of more than 68 million cast. This is a margin of less than 0.2%, while the Electoral College was a far less tight affair, with Kennedy gaining 303 votes to 219 for Nixon. Kennedy had become the youngest person ever to be elected president, and he still is. It would soon be time to govern.